All right, so that's the end of that function. We're going to go down to the next one, which we're going to use to calculate the amount of time needed to pick all of the apples. So this one's going to be another private function. And this one's going to be called calculate time to pick apples. So in this time, our parameters, we're going to be setting variables in here again. This time we're going to be setting the number of trees, which is going to be an array, and we're going to be setting an average, which is going to be an unsigned integer. And the value that we're going to be passing back or returning to our public function this time is going to be an array. So instead of having the void here, it's going to be an array. Let's give a comment in here. Function to calculate the amount of time needed to pick all the apples. All right, so several variables we're going to be creating here. The first one is going to be variable for the total number of apples on all the trees. So variable total number of apples on all trees. And this is going to be total apples to pick will be a number. Next one is going to be a variable that's going to create the array to hold the hours and minutes that are taken. So is there a function called a return to the main function? That's what we're going to be kind of doing last. We're putting the return in here. So this is going to allow us to return it to the main function, basically. So that's going to be one of the last things we do is we're going to create a variable that pulls this information back into the main function and then allows you to trace your result basically in the main function. So that's kind of where we're getting at by returning. So, and if you didn't want to return information all back to the main function, I mean, you could calculate things within these private functions, and this would stay, where it says void. But if it is going to be returning anything to the main function, this needs to specify what type of information it's going to be sending back there. So we will be calling information from these private functions into the main function. That'll be one of the last things that we do. So next variable, this is the one that's going to hold the number of hours and minutes. So for this one, we're going to say time to pick apples, and it's going to be an array. Yeah, I think there might have been some things that I was talking about right before you logged in. But yeah, that's what we'll be going over last. And then make sure after you guys watch this, because this is kind of a long problem. I wanted to do this as an example of like an actual problem, like what you'll be working on, rather than just like the quick examples that are in the other videos. So this one might be a little bit long, but hopefully you can kind of follow along with what's going on with it. But then definitely go back and watch the videos that go along with the assignments for this week, because that's when it really, really explains everything. I just kind of wanted to show you guys like one longer example. All right, so time to pick apples is going to be an array. The next one we're going to be setting is for the number of minutes required to pick all the apples. So this will be a variable called minutes, and it's going to be a number. Next one is for the number of hours required to pick all the apples. So we're going to be figuring our hours and our minutes. This one I'm going to call hours, and it's going to be an unsigned integer. So for the next one, again, like we did back here, we're going to be creating another for each loop. This one, we're going to be basically adding up the apples to pick, and then figuring out the total number of minutes needed, figuring out, so this is basically where we're figuring out all of our time, and then eventually we'll be going back to our public function to pull all this stuff back in there. All right, where are we? Right here. So this is the next thing we're going to be doing is the for each. And we've used I in the last one. I'm going to use J this time. It's going to be a number in trees. And then in here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add our variable to the total apples to pick. So that's showing us that that matches. And then let's say equals total apples to pick plus J. So there's that. Oops, and this is actually add to total number of apples to pick. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is find the total number of minutes needed and then divide the number by the average picked per minute. So we're going to say, and there's a couple different ways you could do this mathematically. This is just one way. So we have total apples to pick divided by average. And then some of these things we haven't actually declared yet, so that's why some of them are underlined for right now. So by the time we are done with this problem, everything will be accounted for. Be calling all the variables back to the beginning. Ooh, excuse me. It's been a long day. All right, so this was divide the number by the average pick per minute. And then we're going to say if our minutes are greater than or equal to 60, then hours equals minutes divided by 60, and minutes equals minutes, we're going to use modulo 60. So that's just basically going to be put out the basically it's going to show us just the remainder from our minutes after it divides that, so we don't have a strange number. So this one is figuring out the number of hours. And then this one is our minutes remaining. Output is the remainder. Okay, so we basically have if our minutes is greater than equal to or 60, it's going to figure out our hours and minutes. If the time needed to pick is less than 60, then we don't have to calculate the hours. So we're going to put in an else statement here. So unlike this problem, when I initially started working on it, you kind of want to go through and try to figure everything out in English. Just talk it out to yourself first, and then go back in and start figuring out, what variables you're going to need, how many functions you're going to need, what types of statements are going to help you figure this out. But that's what really helps for me too, is to really almost like write it out, how you're going to solve the problem first, and then go in and try to put in the code for it. And anytime you can look at code and say it to yourself, like as a sentence, just like a regular sentence in English, that can be really, really helpful. So next thing we're going to do here is our else statement. So we're going to say else if hours equals 0. So hours is set to 0. And then basically the last thing we're going to do here is return the total number of apples and the number of hours and minutes needed to pick all of them. So let's say this is the information we're returning for this function back to our public function. So we'll actually be able to use what we've set and everything we've calculated in this function in our main function. So we're going to return time to pick apples equals total apples to pick, hours, and minutes. So remember we said we were going to return an array for this one. All right. And then our last private function is actually going to be kind of like when we do our trace, we're going to be putting our last one is going to be a print message, which is going to allow us to trace our result back in our public function. So we can go ahead and put that in. So it's going to be after that curly bracket, and of course, always make sure you're really keeping track of your brackets. So, yep, we're in the right place. So this last private function, we're going to call print message. And this is how we're going to basically show the trace back in our main public function. So we're going to call print message. We're going to say average is going to be an unsigned integer. And then we're going to have time. So remember, these are basically variables we're setting here. We're just not putting the VAR. You can leave the VAR out. So, and time, which is going to be an array. And this one, we aren't actually returning anything. We're going to be just pulling this whole thing, which is going to have a trace statement, into our public function. We're not returning any data, basically. So we're not returning a number. We're not returning an array or anything like that. We're just going to be calling just a trace. So this one we can leave our void. And then in here, this is where we're going to put the trace statement. So trace, and we basically want to say you can pick an average number of blank, and it's going to show the average apples per minute. Therefore, you can pick all your apples. All right, so you can pick, not ick, average apples per minute. Therefore, you can pick all your apples. And the next thing, so it's going to be you can pick all your apples. It's going to have the amount of time, apples in about, so it'll have the first time we set was hours and then minutes. So it's going to be putting that information in for us. So go to the next line. So this is going to have our time with our first variable in here from the array. Oops. I keep wanting to hit shift when I shouldn't. All right, so our last thing is going to say you can pick an average of blank apples per minute. Therefore, you can pick all your apples blank, or you can pick all your apples, comma, blank apples in about this many hours and this many minutes. So I think that should be right. All right. So let's go all the way back here to our public function now. And now we're going to be able to return or call some of the information that we figured out in these private functions back in our public function. Okay, so we already have our variable for apples picked per minute, and that is an array. Next thing we're going to put in here is going to be call the function to calculate the average. So here's going to be an example of when we call a function. So we can use the function names, and since we've said down below, so return an amount, and again down here we have return. That's what allows us to bring it back here. So we have variable average apples per tree and unsigned integer equals calculate average apples and did I change that to picked? Nope. So I'll figure that out in a second. All right, so average apples picked apples picked per minute. So that calls a function to calculate the average. And then we already have set an array for the number of apples on each tree. And then the next one we're going to have to do is call the function and pass the parameters from our time. So along with this one, we're going to be setting another variable for our so time to pick apples array. Oops. All right, so we have our calculate time to pick apples. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I'm not skipping anything. Apple tree, and our average apples per tree. And let's go back and just make sure it's clear what all of these are. So this is array of the number of apples on each tree. This one is calls the function and passes the parameters set below in our private function. A wider screen. All right. And then the last thing that we're going to need to put on here is call the print message function and pass those parameters, which is going to be part of what we were working on in that trace. So here we have our average apples per tree and the time to pick apples. All right, so that one was our call the print message and pass parameters from that. So, and the parameters it's passing are what we were setting down here. Sorry, where'd they go? So everything's basically that we're figuring out down here. So we have return there, total apples. We have our return here is figuring out the time to pick the apples. So we're basically just bringing everything back from these private functions back into our public function. And I think I had a couple errors, so let's try to figure out what was going on here.